You're listening to And the Plot Thickens, an Authors on the Air radio network podcast. Join your host, suspense and horror writer Jeff Crawford, as he explores the art of creating tension and mood with authors from a wide variety of genres. Find out more about Jeff and his books at authorjeffcrawford.com. And now, meet today's author guest.
Hey up and welcome to And the Plot Thickens, part of the Authors on the Air global network. I'm your host, Jeff Crawford. My producer is Carrie Schaefer, and with us today is not only a writer who can give us a tutorial, he's a professor who can give us a tutorial. So we're in for a real treat today. We are proud to welcome the great and award-winning writer, David Bell, who just had a new book come out that we'll get into a little bit later. So David, welcome to And the Plot Thickens.
Thank you for having me on. I worry that you built me up too much with that introduction, and now I will never be able to live up to that. But it was very, very nice of you to say things about me like that.
I'm sure that I didn't cover half of what I should have.
Okay.
We're just going to jump right into this. On And the Plot Thickens, we talk about writing dark and suspenseful, intense, and edgy. But today I'm going to start out from a little bit different point of view. As I was doing a little bit of research, something struck me, in particular to you, and that was the titles of your books automatically put at least me, and I think it probably puts every reader already into a particular mood or a place. They're really impactful titles. Do you work off of a title as you go, or does that come up at the end, or where in the process does that happen? And how does it how do you think it impacts your book as far as a mood or a tension builder?
Yeah, I mean, I always have a title in mind when I'm writing the book, and I would say most of the time that doesn't end up being the title of the book when the book is published. And usually that's because I'm perhaps bad at picking titles, and my publisher wants a different title that's more suspenseful or more eye-catching or whatever. So I always have a working title, but that pretty much never ends up being the actual title. And then a lot of times when the book goes in and I pick a title, maybe half the time, my publisher doesn't like my title and I have to change it. So I don't think I'm great at picking titles. But yeah, clearly I think the title is meant to, when we work through the whole process of picking a title, I think the title is meant to evoke something. The title is the way to, in some ways it can tell the reader what kind of book it is. That the title can say, oh, this is a suspense novel, or this is a horror novel, or this is a whatever novel. So the title can do some of that work. The title is often, it's certainly one of the first things that the reader sees with a book. They might see, if they're in the store, they see the title and the cover at the same time, and maybe the author's name if they don't know the author's name. So it's one of the very first things that a reader notices. And I think it can go a long way, like I said, toward getting a reader interested in a book, or curious about a book, or to tell them what kind of book it is. So I think the title can play a big role. Yeah.
I agree. If somebody's looking for a funny romp or a comedy or whatever they're looking for, they're automatically go see by your title, okay, this is something that's going to be a little bit twitchy or dark or edgy, or so you're either going to attract somebody or you're going to pull somebody from all the way across the aisle because they're going to see the pick me up and buy me. So I agree with every bit of that. Um, After writing all the books you've written, what part of writing the darker or edgier parts of a book do you find the hardest to get a reader to see what you're seeing as you write that book or a particular scene? What's the hardest part about that?
I think the hardest part is that people tend to read a lot of books in the same genre. So if someone is picking up my book, they're picking it up because they like suspense novels, and it means that they've probably read a lot of really good suspense novels. They've read Harlan Coben, and they've read Fiona Barton, and they've read all these people, right? And so the hard part is for me to come up with something that they haven't seen before, because these readers have seen all the tricks before, right? So I have to come up with something that they haven't quite seen before, or a character they haven't quite seen before, or a setting that they haven't quite seen before. And I have to try to manage to surprise them in a way that they haven't quite been surprised before, right? And also that, and this is not a criticism of publishing, it's just a fact that once someone does something in a genre that works really well, publishing says, "Hey, let's do that again," right? So there are these little trends that run through, like unreliable narrators or whatever. And so depending on when you show up with your book, people might have read, like, oh, I've read 5 books with unreliable narrators, or like in the case of the finalists, it's a locked room story. They might say, oh, I've already read 10 locked room stories or whatever. So how do you stand out when there's there are certain currents that are happening? People are sophisticated readers. They read read a lot of things. They've seen all the true crime podcasts and the TV shows and the whatever. So the challenge is surprising people who have seen a lot, read a lot, thought about it a lot. And then also for me, if I've written, so the finalist is my 14th book, so I don't want to repeat myself. My editor will come along and say, like I'll have a scene where somebody, murder somebody by hitting them over the head with a lamp. And then my editor will say, well, somebody hit somebody over the head with a lamp 2 books ago. And it's like, I got to come up with a new way to, kill somebody and all that. So those are always the challenges.
Right. Yeah. And I does that become what's the word? Does it become off-putting to you, or does it help you stay on your game by having to be new and fresh all the time, at least in your own mind?
Well, I think it's good for the writer to do that. I mean, the line that I think writers, or the tightrope that writers are always walking if they're writing in the same genre, like mystery and suspense or whatever, is that to some extent, readers and publishers want the same thing. They want to know what they're going to get. But then at the same time, they want something different. So same but different, right? And so that's the line that writers are always walking in a genre. And I think that pushes us to try to be as creative as possible. Where if you're writing in a genre, you're working within a certain box, right? If I'm writing a suspense novel, people don't want to pick it up and find out that it's, like set in an old West town, with like a marshal or whatever, like, and like you said earlier, they don't want like they don't want it to be a rom-com. So like there's a box, but then within that box, how creative can you be? And I think that forces people to try to, writers, to try to think creatively within that window, right, that they're in. So I think that's a good thing for writers to be pushed that way.
I think so too. I do. Um, what makes you nervous or edgy when you're reading?
If a book is really done well, yeah, I do get caught up in it. I worry that the older we get and the more we've read, that we become jaded to to books, right? Because we all probably started reading. A lot of us started reading when we were kids, and there's maybe nothing quite like reading something when you're a kid or seeing a movie when you're a kid and just like getting, completely absorbed in it, and thinking that that world is so real and disappearing into that world. And to some extent, we get a little jaded about that because we know we're reading a book, or maybe we just have less time to read. Like when I was a kid, I could remember just like, lying on the couch all day reading a book, and we don't get to do that much when we're adults. So I worry that we don't get that experience as much, but when someone really does a good job and really captivates us that way, then that must be a really good book if they're getting a jaded adult captivated by a book. So I think anytime something gets us caught up in the emotion of a story, then that writer has done a really good job.
I agree. I agree. Um, this is something that I ask almost everyone who comes on the show because I never get tired of the answer. If we consider a reader being nervous or edgy or jittery, whatever, um, and you consider that as profit to a writer, okay, we've got what we were looking for, from the reader. Which is more profitable to write, the known or the unknown?
Yeah, I think it's a little of both, because a story that is dark or suspenseful or edgy, um, even a story that has the supernatural in it, um, there has to be some entry point of the known, I think, for the reader, that the reader has to say, I recognize something about the character, or the world is, even if it's like a totally fantastical world, the writer has to establish the rules of the world and say this is what everyday life is like in this world, but in some way we're relating to the character, right? Even if it's a character who's very different than us, we understand something about the character. They care about their family, or they're worried about money or whatever, and so we have some entry point to them. So that's the known. I think the known gets established and is something we can relate to, and then the writer is free to go into the unknown. In the kinds of stories I write, a suspense story, my stories tend to take regular people, familiar everyday people who we might be able to relate to, and then putting them in some extraordinary circumstance. Somebody gets kidnapped, somebody disappears, a family member's murdered, some dark secret from the past comes up. And so it's always like that everyday world that we perhaps recognize, and then something bizarre intrudes on it. And maybe we all live in fear of that. We complain if our lives are boring and mundane, but really we want our lives to be boring and mundane, right? Because you don't want, unless it's like winning the lottery, right? You don't want the weird, bizarre thing to happen, because that's no good when the weird, bizarre thing happens. So you live through someone else doing it in a book or in a movie or something like that.
That's a great answer. And everybody's given me an answer, and nobody's summed it up quite like that. I appreciate that.
Well, we should just stop right now. I think to the end. I won't do any better than that.
We'll think about that one. How much is too much as far as keeping a reader in the dark or on edge?
Well, I mean, again, I think that's one of the tightropes that writers walk, and I think this applies to any story. I mean, I'd say that I'm writing suspense stories, but really, any story should be a suspense story, because any story keeps the reader in suspense. If you're watching a romantic comedy, you're feeling suspense because you're wondering what's going to be the answer to the basic question, which is, are they going to get back together? I mean, they're going to get back together, but you're kind of wondering how and when are they going to get back together? So there's suspense. So there should always be suspense. But writers, I think, are always walking the line between saying, I need to dole out enough information that the reader will keep reading and introduce new questions. You might answer a question, but then ask a new question in the course of a book so that the reader keeps coming back. But you're not front loading all the answers so that there's no reason to go on. I mean, we've all had the experience of watching a TV show that starts out really fast. Here's all this intriguing stuff, right? But they never really answer any questions, or it takes a long time to answer questions. And so the viewer gets frustrated and says, I'm not going to stick around if you're not going to give me something, right? You're not going to provide me some information. So I think that's always the challenge, is answering enough questions, giving enough information that the reader is intrigued and keeps going, but not providing all the information up front. So you just say like, well, there's no reason to keep going. So I think that's the line we're always walking.
Good answer. Um, do you keep yourself in suspense as the book evolves, or do you know what's going to happen every step all the way through it?
Well,
I guess that's a backdoor way of saying, do you outline intricately or not? But
I do make an outline or a summary of the book before I start writing it. So I think I know what's going to happen, and I do stick to it pretty well. But stuff always comes up that I hadn't thought of. Stuff always occurs to me, and I realize, well, I had this happening in the outline, but it's not as interesting as if this other thing happened. And sometimes, characters show up who I didn't know were going to show up, or characters do things that I wasn't sure they were going to do. And so that makes it interesting. But even in the scenes when I'm sticking exactly to the outline that I made, it's obviously more suspenseful and more intriguing to be writing it in the moment and seeing it in my head in the moment. So even when I'm sticking directly to the outline, I mean, and the outline I write is pretty unadorned and flat. It just says, like character walks down the street, character does this, character jumps out of a window, whatever. It's all very flat, but writing it and seeing it come to life in the way that it comes to life when it's being written is much more engaging than just an outline. So again, I think I do have an outline. I think I know what's going to happen. Sometimes stuff comes up that I didn't think was going to happen, but even the stuff that I know is going to happen, it's much more fun to write it in novel form than in outline form.
yeah, well, do you think in any way that it helps keep the reader engaged or wondering or emotionally invested if you're writing under the intensity of the moment? Do you think it ever trickles down that far, or can you do the same thing if everything's so technical?
I think that I assume it's always going to be better for the reader if the writer is caught up in the story too, because if the person creating the story is caught up in it, and feels that it's important or vivid or emotional or whatever, then somehow that has to translate to the reader, right? So I think it's always a good thing if a writer is caught up in the story. And then I think that's going to go to the reader somehow. I think I've never felt this way, but I imagine that if a writer was just sitting there and saying, well, I'm just going through the motions. Yeah, he runs down the street. Yeah, he throws the baby out the window, then the reader's going to pick up on that some way, in the way that, like, if you have to, like if you have to send some boring email, or you're like doing your taxes and you're just like, yeah, I'm just doing this. I don't think people at the IRS are getting tax returns and they're like, wow, this guy was really into his taxes. Look how vividly he wrote about his, so I think that a reader can see that and say, like, well, it felt like the person on the other end was alert and engaged. I hope it does.
I think so. I think there's maybe it boils down to word choice as a writer. if you're in that moment, I think you use and think of words and vocabulary and dialogue and conversations and descriptions that you would maybe never have used if you weren't in that moment. Uh, and because of that, that's how I was thinking it may trickle down to the reader. You've made something more vibrant or more alive to them just because it was to you when you wrote it.
Right. And I imagine that the more engaged the writer is, then perhaps the better, more vivid choices they'll make in terms of language or whatever. And the more vivid those choices are, then the more vivid the story is for the reader, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I would hope that translates to the reader somehow.
Well, I tell you what, everything you've said today tells me that every reader is going to have a wonderful time with any of your books. Um, you sound like you sound to me like you just can't wait to sit down and write every time it's time to write. You're not going to be phoning it in, and that's to me that's a wonderful thing.
I don't phone it in, but I am fundamentally lazy. So sometimes I have to, the problem is the internet, the Hemingway, they never had to worry about being distracted by the internet on the computer. I think it's much more impressive what we do today, because we could easily just go look at YouTube videos all day or check the news. That's the task we have to deal with.
Yeah, my life as a writer got much harder when I discovered TikTok. And my phone was sitting right beside me.
Yeah.
Yeah. David, it has been such a genuine pleasure having you here today, and I hope you'll agree to come back someday so we can continue this discussion.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Before you get gone, tell all the listeners where they can find your latest book, The Finalist, and your other books as well, plus keep up with you.
Well, The Finalist is out. It's been out for just about a month. It's in all the stores, your favorite indie bookstore, Target, those sorts of places, so you can track it down anywhere. And if you want to find out all the exciting things I'm up to, my website is davidbellnovels.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and all of those are David Bell Novels. And that's where I post, events and when books are coming out and all that stuff. So please follow me on there, and I'm always happy to hear from readers in those places.
Fantastic. I hope you have I hope you just have an onslaught of new fans because they've heard you here today. I really do.
I hope it's going to be like Beatlemania.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes.
I hope so. And thank you again so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It was good to talk to you.
You've been listening to And the Plot Thickens, part of the Authors on the Air Global Network. Follow the show and listen to previous shows on the And the Plot Thickens page on Facebook. Listen and watch on YouTube, Anchor, SoundCloud. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok to hear more about these shows and the books that I've written. Join us next time for another great episode. And until then, read a book to let everyone know you read the book and leave a review. Reviews do matter. Have a great week, and AM, we're still behind you, buddy. Thank you very much.